were seeing about false prophets. So, false prophets from the Bible. Who are the false prophets? Mark 7:7. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. See, tradition, human tradition. These people, they teach us human tradition instead of teaching what is said in the CCC. That's why there are a lot of false images drawn from this word. That's what we saw in CCC 2779. So, false prophets are people who had false images in their hearts. But here, God has to decide on Judgment Day on some other basis, not according to sin. See, sin, the actual meaning of sin is different from what the tradition says. So the tradition brings sin inside the faith of Catholic Church, and they preach something else, something opposite to what the CCC says. So God has to decide on Judgment Day on not this basis, on not this human precepts, but on the basis of what He has planned. He has planned something. With another verse from the Bible, Romans 10th chapter, verse 3. If you go, for being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God and seeking to establish their own, they have not submitted to God's righteousness. See, God has to decide on this basis. On the Judgment Day, He is going to decide only on this basis, that whether we have submitted ourselves to God's righteousness. God has something. See, for being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God. So God has a righteousness, and if you are ignorant, that is another point, will come later, and seeking to establish their own. So these people, they try to establish their own righteousness. These people are false prophets. So if we follow them, then we will become people who do idol worship. So God decides on that basis, whether we accept Him as our Father or whether we go after human precepts. See, the expression God the Father had never been revealed to anyone, is what is said in 27:79. So, even to Moses and all it goes, we'll go into the subject. So, if I give it in the form of a story, you will understand how sin does not interfere with this judgment. See, the whole world is believing that we will be punished if we sin. But only when we look with the perspective of the parable, we find out that there is nothing to do with this human sins. So, sin is not an aspect God considers to decide on what to do on Judgment Day. How He decides is that He gave the freedom of free choice to us. If you want, you can see Sirach 15th chapter 14th to 17th verse. We are not going to go now, but we can refer if you want. How God decides is that He gave the freedom of free choice to us, and God has to say or decide and declare in the Judgment Day whether I have chosen life or whether I have chosen death. See, He gives us a freedom of free choice, free human being we are, where we can choose between life and death. So, in this world, he is asking us to choose, of course, through the cross and other things and all. Through temptations, trials, and so on. We say to God whether we want to be filially adopted by Him or whether we don't want to be filially adopted by Him. So that is death. If we don't want to be filially adopted, we choose death. If we want to be filially adopted, we choose life. This is the decision God has to make. Death means no relationship with God. Life means filial adoption by God. So on this basis, the parable of the banquet helps us understand how God the Father makes His decision. For this purpose, God the Father is symbolized here as a wealthy man. Likewise, the functioning of the Catholic Church is portrayed like the role of a steward or a manager of the household. The church here is symbolized as the mother of God, mother of the church. The reason for this is that for personification, for this allegory, we need a person there. So the church can be personified as a lady, as a stewardess, or a steward. And if at all we want to show someone as a lady, the best person we can show is none other than the mother of the church. See, we want to show someone as someone who existed before making of the plan. So for as if you compare that as a symbolize for something, then it means that we need a person before the creation of this world. So for this purpose, we have introduced a character. If you don't want, you can keep it as an imaginary character. If you like Mother Mary to be present even before creation, then you can even think of it as Mother Mary. That's not a problem. That does not interfere with any of the dogmas of the church or the doctrines or even the anathemas. So there is no problem. Therefore, here it is portrayed as if God is speaking to our mother, and that it starts there. Therefore, here I am thinking of distributing my property, the wealthy man says to her. The wealthy man's reply here, he is telling it first to the stewardess or steward, the church. But before studying almost any parable, every Catholic should first read the teaching found in CCC 1 and then identify whether the characters in the parable fit within that teaching. So when we read a parable in the Bible, we must not just read it as something like a story or something like that. We must fit that characters within the teachings of the church and find out what that character is trying to tell us. Therefore, we should identify in a parable, any parable if you take, we should identify the characters and find out whether it will fit within that teaching. When viewed in this way, we understand that God's purpose in creating human being is to make us share in His own divine life. And then salvation consists in God's adopting us as His children.